Today's podcast is brought to you in part by Real Marketing, the only marketing firm recommended exclusively by the Institute. Real Marketing utilizes over 25 years of expertise, and their products are built and customized for you to dominate any neighborhood anywhere. Go to realmarketingforyou.com. That's realmarketing4you.com. Also, look for past A State of Mind episodes with CEO David Collins as our guest. Jack, it's great to see you.
Hi, Tami. Good to see you too.
Excellent. So I'm kind of excited about today's topic, and it might be a little surprising because inspections, right? What kind of a podcast topic is that? But I was at a closing last week, and one of the obligatory forms in our closing packages is an acknowledgement that a radon gas inspection has not been done, right? So think about it. In my marketplace, we don't do radon inspections because we have no basements, right? We're at sea level. And so this form just made me think about the fact that people coming from other areas are sometimes surprised at what inspections are or aren't done. Then we started brainstorming, Jack, you and I, on text and through the Google Drive, and I realized just how deep that was. So let's talk first, kind of set the stage. What are the ordinary inspections that you see done? And we'll trade off and see which are in your market and which are in mine and which are in both.
Well, you mentioned radon. That's very common in our market. We don't necessarily have a lot of basement homes, but we do have a lot of crawl space homes. And then we have quite a few walkout basements. In other words, daylight basements where it's kind of rolling topography and it creates a basement space. So yeah, radon's a big deal here. And for the listeners who may not be familiar with radon, it's a carcinogen. It's a gas that emanates from the soil, and it tends to be concentrated in certain pockets of the country. And this is one of those areas where there is a lot of radon. And it's interesting too, because it tends to concentrate in certain areas of a given market. It's so prevalent in our area that a lot of the builders do passive radon systems preemptively, and some of the counties in our area actually require it as part of codes to put a passive system in. And that's basically piping between the walls and electrical, so that basically if you ever do a radon test and the gas is identified, then you can simply add the fan to it and it makes the system active. So that's a very common test in the market.
Yeah, and I hear that a lot from people coming from other parts of the country. But interestingly, so Florida, you think Florida is all the same, most people do, but just a couple of hours south of us, they do radon inspections because they have an awful lot of quarries just inland from the coast. And so it's ordinary there. So even just a couple of hours difference can make a big change. And also, I've heard from some luxury agents that really large homes that have an awful lot of granite or stone, that type of material, that they will do them there because just the quantity of those materials can actually leach some of that. Have you encountered that with a really large property with a lot of that?
No, that's the first I've heard that, actually. That's interesting.
It is. So I think in most markets, everybody has the general inspection, right? The regular home inspection, and they go through and do things. But there's some other inspections that happen. For example, 4-point insurance inspections are critical in my marketplace. Florida is one of those spots where the insurance companies would love to never write another homeowner's insurance policy in the state again. So they have implemented a requirement for this, what's called the 4-point, which is the roof, the AC, the plumbing, and the electricity, right? So warranting that those items are all in order, and they have some requirements about types of wiring, for example, and the age requirement on the roof. So that's something that is absolutely required in my market. But Jack, you said you'd never heard of one.
No, well, not that terminology.
Mm.
I think it's interesting too, just off topic slightly. We're talking about all these, less typical inspections. It's very interesting that during 2021 and the first half of 2022, when so many markets across the country were experiencing this surge, of buyers and this rush when the interest rates were so low, a lot of buyers were waiving inspections altogether to make their offers more competitive and more attractive to sellers. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen in a few years as people start discovering some of the latent defects that might be present in some of those homes where those types of transactions occur. That'll be very interesting.
You are absolutely right. And that frightened me when that happened, that people were willing to waive inspections. There was one house in particular. I had sellers who had lost a number of deals. They were $1 million buyers, and they so desperately wanted a house, right, that they were trying to figure out how they could fit a square peg in a round hole. And there was one old, probably 100-year-old Mediterranean home that we walked into. We walked in the front door, and I could smell the mold. Right? I can smell that. I have one of those sensitive sniffers, right? And the husband said, I don't smell anything. And I'm like, you cannot buy this home without having an inspection, right? And they were so disappointed, but absolutely there was no way that I was going to let them to do that. But we also saw a lot of people doing pre-inspections during that time, especially in the luxury market, so that at least a buyer had the opportunity to review a report, even if they didn't order it, to have a better sense. And
what we did was so interesting. We got so frustrated with these multiple offer situations during that time period that we would actually bring the home inspector to a lot of our private home tours, because the buyers were so intent this was going to be the house that if they wanted to make an offer, they wanted the home inspector to do a basic overall inspection. And they weren't checking every window and every outlet, but checking the major things like the mechanical, the roof, plumbing, the air conditioning, et cetera, the big things, the big ticket items. So that was another thing that we dealt with during that time period. Tammy, you were talking about insurance. Another interesting, it's not so much an inspection as a due diligence, but it's closely related. And that's a loss history report. Years ago, I think this was referred to in the insurance industry as a CLUE report.
Right.
An acronym, and I don't even know what it stood for. I don't remember. But loss history reports are used universally with insurance companies across the country, so that if you go to get home insurance, for example, and you're using State Farm will pull the history on that particular house with the various insurance companies it may have been, covered by previously, and they look for claims that have been made on that property. That's a very interesting report to get to. And your luxury home buyers are more sophisticated buyers typically, and they know to ask about this. And really all buyers should ask about it. But they can look at that report, they can get it pulled by their insurance company and see if any claims have been made in that house. Now, the reality is there could have been things in that home like flooding or lightning or fires or who knows what, that weren't necessarily, that wouldn't necessarily turn up in that report because the homeowner had to make a claim.
Right.
But in most cases, homeowners do make claims. And if you have a homeowner that either one, simply doesn't know about the history of the home, they may not know there was a fire in the home at one point in time.
Yep.
Or two, worse, that perhaps they did know, but they're not properly disclosing what they do know.
Right.
That report is a great tool for home inspectors because it gives them a footprint to say, hey, I want to really check out the attic because there was a fire here in 1992, and I want to make sure that there was no damage to electrical components or systems or what have you. So it's a real assistance to the
So
home.
Jack, that makes me think of in our market area, a little further north than my core area, there has been a lot of, I hate to say it out loud, sinkhole activity, right? Because that's just like the buzzword.
Sure.
And there were a lot of folks when this was happening that were making claims and getting huge payouts and then not doing the work. Right. Now, obviously, if there's an active sinkhole in your front yard and you're on the evening news, then that's going to be something. But everybody was going after these, these insurance claims. And so that's one of the things that that can trigger the need to look and see if they've got documentation that they actually did repairs. So,
Yeah, and more commonly, at least more commonly in our market, Tami, if you look at that report and you see where a claim was made perhaps a couple of years earlier on a roof, and you look with a home inspector, and the home inspector says, hey, this roof looks to be 10, 15, 20 years old or whatever, and yet the homeowner made a claim and got compensated for a new roof, that gives you, some ammo when you go into your negotiations on repairs when it comes to the condition of that roof that they didn't have replaced.
yeah, that's a good point. And that
Um,
also makes me think about the note that you made about dueling inspectors and
yeah.
buyers, especially in the upper tier that are pretty savvy. They may come at it from a different perspective. Tell me what you mean by dueling inspectors.
Well, we've seen this a few times through the years. It's really wonderful. That the first time I experienced it, it kind of scared me, to be honest. We had a home buyer who was purchasing. It was an older historic home here in Brentwood, and it was actually located just across the street from, at the time, Tim McGraw and Faith Hill's home. Theirs was a newer home. The one that we represented the buyer on was an historic home. And so our client, who has become a lifelong client, he asked for our toughest home inspectors, and he chose two. And so I told my business partner, I said, well, this deal's dead. He's trying to find a way to get out of the deal. We haven't got into it all the way yet. And it was interesting because he took the two stacks of documents when he printed them out, and he did like a comparative analysis, essentially, of all the repairs or potential repairs, the defects, looked through all of it and said, okay, I'll buy it as is. And so he wasn't trying to nickel and dime, so to speak, the seller on a bunch of line item repairs on an older home. He simply wanted to know what he was buying. I thought it was a terrific strategy, just making sure you're protecting your assets.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fantastic. Absolutely. Let's see, termite. Yeah, termite inspections, right? So here in my area, we have an awful lot of older home inventory and an awful lot of wood frame construction. So we joke about the fact that either you have termites, or you've had termites, or you will have termites, right? So termites are they're a little flying insect that likes to chew on wood, and they swarm, and they really love our climate here, and they love all the wood frames. So it is extremely common. As a matter of fact, it's almost a given that when you schedule the general inspection and the 4-point and the termite inspection, just to see if there's been any significant damage or if there's any evidence of live activity. And then you have the ability to negotiate for fumigation or transfer of a warranty or whatnot. But a lot of people from other markets are just completely freaked out when we even mention the word, right?
Well, it's interesting because if you think about luxury homes have luxury landscaping, and unless you live in a desert type climate, luxury landscaping typically means large landscape beds around the perimeter of the house filled with mulch, which is code for termite food. That actually attracts the termites. It's the perfect environment for them because it's not just that it's mulch, but it's irrigated. And so now we've added moisture.
Nice and moist.
Yeah, perfect for termites. And so we're saying, hey, termites, come here, have a meal. So it makes good sense to have a termite inspection. But interestingly, Tami, lenders have stopped that requirement. Most lenders require termite inspections for most of my career, but over the last 10 years, most lenders seem to have dropped that requirement.
I have observed the same. So that is interesting, and I'm curious about that. But I'm not gonna ask too loudly of my lender colleagues because it's not normal that they remove requirements as opposed to adding them. So,
you guys, just out of curiosity, do you guys do in the Florida market? Do you do baiting systems, or what's the typical termite treatment?
So there's two different types of termites. The ones that I was talking about, which are more common here, Oh gosh, I've lost the name. It'll come to me in a second. So,
Subterranean.
right. So subterranean is not as common here. I think that's the ones that you're probably more used
Yeah.
to. They burrow
Mhm.
into the soil. And then for those, you would definitely use a baited system, a
Right.
baiting system. And so the flying termites, and somebody who's listening to this is going to go, wow, she absolutely had a brain freeze moment that she's not coming up with that name. Um, but for those, you would do fumigation and then just periodic spot checks and that sort of thing.
Swarming
Yep,
termites.
yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yep. So then that takes us into another direction as well. So when we talk about some of the specialty inspections that may not happen in every case, but especially if a buyer's ever had a bad experience with something, then they have an extra expectation. And certainly some folks want a special roof inspection as opposed to just the general. But you mentioned some things like water quality and air quality and asbestos. So tell us a little bit about your experience with those types of issues.
Well, a lot of the environmental issues that I think a lot of our luxury home buyers test for are particularly common when you look at older and historic homes. So in our market, like a lot of markets, we have some really beautiful neighborhoods that are 100, 150 years old and have these gorgeous, Queen Anne's, Victorians, and various classic architecture. And but with these older homes, a lot of times they have older components. And so when you look at the pipes that run from the street into the house, they may have copper pipes, for example, or
Hmm.
pipes that are eroding. And so, that's one of the things they want to inspect. They want to see the quality of the pipes and the quality of the water that comes through pipes into the house. Is it good drinking water? Is it safe drinking water? Most importantly, typically it is, but they want to check these things to make sure. Asbestos is real common because a lot of homes that were built here turn of the century, asbestos was used for insulation purposes. It was used in shingles on top of homes. When you see shingles today, asphalt shingles, you see the streaking on shingles. That didn't really happen so much in asbestos shingle. That was a really nice quality of the asbestos.
Yeah.
But
Same
unfortunately,
thing. Just to interrupt for a second on the
yeah,
asbestos, we have a lot of asbestos siding from homes that
siding,
were
right?
built in the 40s and the
Right.
50s. And inspectors will tell you it was the best material ever. It was the best building construction material. But because it had that compressed asbestos in it, they discontinued it. So that's an interesting thing and not one that you can really remediate. It's just an awareness kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and I mean, the remediation in that case is removing the asbestos shingles, replacing them. That's something too. You can't just go hire, general contractor or handyman to remove asbestos. You need to hire a professional, and these are expensive professionals because they encapsulate. They wear special masks and special uniforms, et cetera, to handle it, and yada yada. So it gets to be very, or could potentially be very expensive. And in the case of insulated pipes, a lot of times they'll encapsulate those just so it simply can't be, because asbestos is not inherently in the air because it's there.
Right.
It's disturbed is what
Yep.
becomes the issue, is my understanding. By the way, as we're talking about environmental type things and these specialty type inspections, there's one that we do here a fair amount that I bet you do a whole lot, and that's stucco, synthetic stucco. Talk to us about that, Tammy.
Actually, we lucked out because all that synthetic stucco that was happening in other markets, we've had typically the authentic real
Hardwood.
stucco. So we have not seen an issue with that, although it does make me think of that period in the late 90s and the early
Yeah.
2000s when you had the Chinese drywall.
Yep. Exactly.
So anything in that time frame triggers a separate inspection for that.
So
But
along with those, when you talk about these environmental issues, another is air. You've got some buyers who have high sensitivity. It may be specific to that person, but they have high sensitivity to air quality.
yep,
Particularly like you mentioned earlier in the broadcast about smelling mold and having that mold sensitivity. Some people can live in a house with mold and have no issues whatsoever, and others have a high sensitivity to it. So our buyers who have high sensitivity, will almost routinely do some sort of mold testing before they purchase a home, or at least during the due diligence periods. That's very common.
Yeah. And when you were talking about the mulch and the landscaping and that sort of thing, you mentioned that that you all do soil testing, right? And so Perc sites,
Yeah.
I don't even know what a Perc site is. So see, that's the value of these podcasts, is because even between you and I, there are things that we don't know about each other's markets.
Well, when you get when you're in an urban area like where you live or in Nashville proper, we're on sewer systems. Well, when you get into the semi-rural and rural areas, there's no sewer lines often cases, and so homes are built with septic tanks. Or new construction, they have to have the soil tested to see if the soils are proper for a septic tank, or if they need to require some alternative system. So the Perc test is basically soil scientists come in and identify the quality of the soils and absorption rates to see, for example, can you build a 5-bedroom home on this 5-acre property? Just because there's ample space for it doesn't mean you have the right soils for it. One of the things is kind of a red flag in our market. If you look at a rural area and you see a lot of rock, exposed rock on the soil, top of the soil, a lot of rocks laying on top of the soil, cedar trees, those are typically indicative of bad soils for Perc tests. So even if and on that note, if you have a home that already exists on a piece of property with a septic tank, you want to make sure that you do your due diligence and see, does this 5-bedroom home, was it in fact permitted for a 5-bedroom septic tank? Because people might have a Perc test that said, oh yeah, you can build a 3-bedroom home, but they built a 5-bedroom home on that space because they said, well, it's only, me and Mima all living here. We don't have to worry about having that ample septic tank. But it's very important to lenders and people when they're looking at the value of the property, because it's only really a 3-bedroom house if that's what it was Perc for. The other aspect of testing soils, Tami, for our market anyway, is the quality of the soils in terms of structural integrity of the soils. And soil scientists will test for what's called here colluvial soils. So on these hillside homes, for example, they want to make sure the soil is stable enough to build a house on the side of a mountain or the side of a hill. And so that's also a big deal in our area.
Interesting. And then fireplaces was one that came up. And I have to tell you that there's not necessarily a fireplace inspection vendor, but one of our regular fireplace maintenance is actually Chimney Sweep, and they come out in tuxedo and top hat.
Yeah. Why do you
right?
Why do you have fireplaces in Florida?
For looks.
Yeah, right. Because it's pretty.
Right. And so the thing that we do here is, I imagine, climate has changed since the 1800s, 1900s. I think that there was some expectation of folks that were from up north that you can't have a house without a fireplace. Maybe they had a few days of winter, but otherwise you'll see them used for ambiance, or sometimes if a wood burning fireplace is there, you'll turn the AC down real low and then light a fire. Right. But we do have a fair amount of fireplaces, and those inspections are really important. What do you see about that in your market, Jack?
Well, in our market, first of all, we use our fireplaces. We use them a lot. And the thing is, if you buy a home with a fireplace, keep in mind we have fireplaces inside the home and we have fireplaces outside, like on porches. We have a fireplace on our back porch. And so some fireplaces are full masonry fireplaces, meaning they can burn wood. You might have a gas starter, but it's a wood burning fireplace. And some fireplaces are gas only, and some are recirculating or whatever. But anyway, testing fireplaces is important because if you discover a fireplace issue after you close, sometimes those issues are so significant you can't safely ever have a fire in that fireplace without completely rebuilding that fireplace. So particularly on these older and historic homes, that can be extremely expensive. But even on newer construction, sometimes you'll have a newer home and the firebox is cracked or something like that. And those are the things you want to have inspected to make sure, one, it's safe to use, and two, it may need repairs that the seller really ought to have repaired before closing. They did do fireplace maintenance. I was going to ask you about one that I know is common, has to be common for your market, irrigation.
Yes. So most general inspectors will address the irrigation system. And we're pretty straightforward. Either it's on city water or it is on a well pump. And so it's not often that we would have a separate irrigation inspection unless the general inspector identified some issues, right? So sprinkler heads or pressure issues or something like that. But that would be something that would just be called in if there was an issue. And that raises the point too is, we put these inspection windows down so narrowly to try to win the contract. And we need to make sure that we are allowing adequate time to call in a specialist if something's identified in the general.
No, absolutely. And particularly when the market's more competitive, people are starting to tighten that window up. That becomes critical. But you talked about on the irrigation. In our market, irrigation inspections, again, in luxury homes is pretty common. But there's a couple of issues. One is the general home inspectors typically don't do irrigation. That is absolutely a separate inspection in most cases. The other challenge that we have, because we have 4 distinct seasons, is we winterize our irrigation systems. And so if you buy a home and you want to test irrigation, it's January, you can't test the irrigation. So then it becomes important for the buyer to secure documentation either with the original offer or as part of the repair negotiations that the seller provide documentation showing that the system was properly winterized and was in good working order at the time it was winterized.
Very
It becomes
interesting.
a disclosure. Yeah, it becomes a disclosure issue because those can get pretty pricey too, depending on how extensive the irrigation system.
You're absolutely right. And so especially as we kind of shift into talking about more expensive properties with unique features, so your winterization comment absolutely makes me think of both swimming pools and seawalls, right? And marine equipment, which here we don't do anything with them. I mean, we use them all year long. And I kind of chuckle when I'm in markets where they have to, drain and winterize their swimming pool and all that. But most people are satisfied with a general inspector's opinion. And in this market, they typically will offer an opinion from, with some caveats that they have not, gone into the pool or under. But we will make sure that if we are representing a buyer that is purchasing a property with a seawall, right? So we're talking about saltwater, navigable water, that we will have a seawall inspection done. And that brings up the point of most general inspectors are not in the business of fixing the things that they find. But when you get into specialty arenas like seawalls, most of the folks that are out there doing those inspections are also the companies that do the work. And so I'm always a little hesitant. So we take the time to go out and hire seawall engineers who don't have companies that do the work. And that takes longer, right? They're harder to get. So again, you're squeezing that time. And a swimming pool would be if something was a concern to the general inspector. How about you for swimming pools or for lake properties or things of that nature?
Well, yeah, pools and spas, definitely, I would say almost every purchase that we ever represent a buyer on, if there's pools and spas, we're recommending, first of all, they have those inspected because they can look beautiful, but have all kinds of hidden issues. Unless you're a really sophisticated buyer in terms of pool and spa equipment, you're not going to know about until you start using it. We had a situation years ago where the seller was not our client, but we represented the buyer, and the seller disclosed the pool was in great working order, and they provided us wonderful documentation. And then my client got into the home and discovered the pool was leaking. It was losing water routinely. And the neighbors said, "Oh yeah, that's been doing that for years." And so they absolutely misrepresented the condition of that pool. And so, the inspection is a critical piece. No matter how nice the seller may seem or how nice the neighborhood is, it's an important inspection to do. So yeah, it's very common. We don't have, it's interesting when you talk about waterfront property. So your waterfront is ocean, bay, marinas, and
canals,
right? So our waterfront here is basically river and lakes. And our waterfront property here is controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers. So when you buy a lakefront property, for example, you may have full rights to the lake and have a private dock, but you don't really own the land that touches the water. That land's owned by the Army Corps of Engineers. You may have the right to mow it. In some cases, the Corps actually allows you to irrigate from the lake. You might have an irrigation system coming in from the lake. You can't get those anymore that I'm aware of in our market, but there are some that were grandfathered in. So you have permits, but you also have to have a permit for your dock. So having your dock inspected and making sure that the documentation is on file with the Army Corps of Engineers is really critical, because you could buy a piece of property, one, that's advertised as lakefront, perfect for your private dock and blah, blah, blah. But if you don't verify there's a permit on file, you can't build a dock
Right.
on that property. And if a dock ever gets condemned, the chances of having that permit renewed with a new owner to build a new dock is slim to none in many cases. So it's really critical that you have those types of inspections and evaluating the paperwork associated with the Corps of Engineers. We don't have seawalls. I've sold a lot of waterfront property here, and I've actually only had one homeowner that had two pieces of property with seawalls, because again, the Corps doesn't allow you to do that any longer. They want to keep all of the perimeter of the lake and the rivers in its natural habitat.
Sure. Natural shoreline.
Natural shorelines, yeah. So
Yep.
seawalls and seeing riprap and the stone, everything like that at the edge of the water of the lake, you don't see that very often here.
Well, I want to take us one step further and talk about the things that you might only find in serious luxury properties that would be totally different. And the first thing that comes to mind is wine storage, right? Because your general inspector is not going to have any idea about that, both temperature and all that. Who do you go to for something like that?
Well, I mean, the same people who install wine cellars in our market are the same folks you'd want to have evaluate an existing wine cellar in our market. So that's who we would go to. And you're right, depending on some people call it a wine cellar. It's nothing more than a drywalled room in the basement, with some pretty shelving and wine. That's not really a wine cellar, but if they've got conditioned and humidified space, that they control, usually with split systems, that sort of thing, that all needs to be evaluated. And you're right, that oftentimes is beyond the scope of a general home inspector.
Yeah. And the same would go for whole home automation.
Yeah,
right. There's not a third party vendor that would come inspect. You have to rely on the companies that install. But think about that when we talk about major financial consequences if there is something that is wrong, right? Let's say that you've got a luxury home that was built 10 years ago with a whole home automation system, and that technology is completely out of date, right? The buyer would absolutely need to know what kind of investment they were going to need to make in order to have that system in working order now.
Well, and part of the problem is with technology is that some companies completely go out of business, so that they don't exist any longer. And you want to make sure you can get components and get things replaced or repaired. Or the other part of it is perhaps the system is a good system and it still has parts available and that sort of thing. But the people who installed that particular system were no longer in your marketplace. And some of these things are very complex. And so it's very important to get really good records from your seller and find out who is their, who their contractors are, who they do business with, service providers, because they can be your best asset especially during the transition time. But you want to know during the home inspection, does everything in the system work? And again, that's really beyond the scope of your general home inspector.
Yeah, bet.
I've got a question for you, Tami, and I've only heard this a couple of times, but I have a feeling it might be more common there. What about, have you had any homes that have built-in saltwater aquariums? Is that something you see at all?
It does happen, and of course, it would only happen in much more expensive homes. And there again, you're going to have to call someone who installs and services those systems to come and evaluate. But super, super important to do so, because they can cause massive damage if anything is not in working order, right? You're talking about big things. And it makes me bring up the point also that there's a lot of condominiums, luxury condominiums here, that do not allow aquariums, whether built in or not,
Oh, well,
because of the risk
yeah.
to the actual building and the others. But they would definitely have to rely on the vendor that did the installation and the service.
Well, one of the things that we didn't talk about, at least before the podcast, that just comes to mind. One of the things I've had several clients inspect is doing structural inspections for weight, and talking about aquariums made me think about that. So, for example, you've got a client who wants to have private training. They want to have a gym in their home. They're used to always having a private gym in their home, and they're looking for space in this new home they're purchasing, whether it's new construction or existing. And you can't just go put gym equipment on a second or third floor of a building without evaluating the structure will it support it. So some of these folks have very extensive gyms, home gyms, and you need to make sure that the flooring system is designed to accommodate the weight. So I've had folks do that before too. That sort of inspection.
Sure, sure. Now, I want to, as we wrap our time together, I want to talk about some things, some takeaways from this that can help those real estate professionals who are listening use this information to absolutely differentiate themselves in the eyes of working with luxury buyers. And the first thing that comes to mind is we do all these beautiful marketing materials for sellers, right? The pre-listing material and how to sell your home, but we often forget about the buyers. And so I've seen some amazing pieces that were designed to educate buyers coming in from outside of the market. And then recently, I was chatting with a digital media specialist about how to embrace TikTok for those of us in our age range, and does that have a place? And they were saying that absolutely, it's like infotainment. So think about that. Do short little videos that talk about, have you ever had a radon inspection, or something along those lines. Short little educational videos that could be either TikTok or just in a YouTube channel. But think about how valuable that would be for a buyer and how much that would set you apart.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I would challenge our listeners. A lot of the topics that you and I are covering over the last few months would be great talking points for any of our agents in the listening audience to create their own platform and their own product to broadcast on TikTok videos or on Facebook or whatever the platform they're using. We've covered a lot of great topics. They can take our talking points and use those to benefit them and their own clients.
Yep, you're absolutely right. I think that everybody that's out there listening is listening so that they can learn and do better. And so that's a great point of taking this one step further. Well, Jack, I have a feeling that you and I could go on talking about inspections and interesting experiences that we've had for a long time, but it's time for us to wrap up for today. And so I want to thank you, Jack, and I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us on this episode of A State of Mind, the Art of Selling Luxury Real Estate. If you're interested in learning more about the Institute, you can find out more at luxuryhomemarketing.com. If you like what you just heard, please share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And if you've got a hot topic that you'd like us to discuss in a future podcast, feel free to let us know. Send an email to info@luxuryhomemarketing.com. Thanks so much for listening.